The ocean has always carried secrets, but some mysteries refuse to be silenced. Off the American East Coast, divers recently located a World War II submarine, long believed lost, in 1945. The discovery stunned naval historians, for the vessel lay preserved on the seabed, its steel hull still intact after 7 decades. Questions erupted immediately. How had it vanished so completely, and why had it remained hidden until now? Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, you'll find powerful true stories from history, tales that remind us of courage, sacrifice, and the echoes of the past still shaping our present. For Daniel Harris, the news struck a nerve sharper than for most. At 33, Daniel worked as a naval historian in Norfolk, Virginia, balancing the dusty quiet of archives with the unpredictable thrill of deep-sea diving. His fascination with submarines wasn't just professional, it was personal. Growing up, he often noticed his grandfather sitting alone on the porch at dusk, staring silently toward the horizon. The old man rarely spoke of his wartime service, brushing off questions with a smile and a change of subject. Yet Daniel sensed weight behind that silence, as though the sea had claimed more than words. When the discovery made national headlines, Daniel felt a strange pull, as if the past had suddenly reached forward to grab his sleeve. The submarine wasn't just a relic, it might hold answers to his family's unspoken questions. Norfolk itself reminded him daily of history's presence. Navy ships loomed along the harbor, their grey hulls etched against the skyline. Veterans filled coffee shops with their stories, and naval families walked the streets with a quiet sense of pride and duty. To live here meant to breathe in salt air mixed with tradition. Daniel loved it, but he also carried a restless curiosity. That night, he sat in his study surrounded by books and maps. The glow of his desk lamp fell across stacks of wartime journals, photographs, and naval records he had spent years collecting. A headline stared up at him from the local newspaper. Sunken World II submarine found after 70 years, resting intact on the ocean floor. He whispered to himself, "Why now? Why this one?" His thoughts circled back to his grandfather, who had passed away 5 years earlier without ever speaking about the war. Daniel's mother once told him, "Some things were too heavy for him, Daniel. He carried them alone." But what if this submarine was part of that weight? The unanswered questions kept him awake. He imagined the men who had served on that vessel, ordinary sailors, young and full of dreams, now frozen in time beneath the waves. What had been their final moments? Were they victims of enemy fire, or had fate turned cruel in another way? By morning, Daniel had resolved to act. He would not simply read about the submarine in newspapers, he would go see it, study it, and uncover its story. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Diving at such depths required skill, precision, and a careful respect for danger. But beyond the technical risks, there was another challenge, confronting whatever truth the submarine carried. He reached for his phone and called Commander Robert "Bob" Miller, a retired naval officer and longtime mentor. Bob had guided him since his early college days, offering insight into both naval history and the discipline it demanded. The old commander answered with his usual gravelly warmth. "Daniel," Bob said, "I saw the news too. I figured you'd be calling me." "You know me too well," Daniel replied with a tired laugh. "I need to learn everything I can about that sub." "Do you think it's possible?" Bob paused before answering. "Possible, yes. Simple. No. You'll be chasing shadows through records the Navy buried decades ago. But if anyone can make sense of it, it's you." The encouragement strengthened Daniel's resolve. He felt both excitement and dread, aware that some truths might cut deeper than expected. Still, the decision had been made. The submarine was waiting, and with it the story his grandfather never told. And so began Daniel Harris's pursuit of answers, a journey that would test not only his knowledge and skill, but also his heart. The past had surfaced, and it demanded to be heard. History often speaks in fragments, in lines of faded ink and official phrases that conceal more than they reveal. For Daniel Harris, the more he read about the vanished submarine, the louder the silence around it seemed. The official Navy record listed its last known transmission on April 10, 1945, somewhere off the East Coast. After that, nothing. No distress call, no survivors, no wreckage found at the time. It was as though the sea had swallowed it whole and conspired to keep the truth buried. The 1940s were a dangerous era for submariners. The Atlantic teemed with German U-boats, and American vessels patrolled constantly, hunting enemies that were often invisible until it was too late. Torpedo Alley, as sailors grimly nicknamed the waters near North Carolina, claimed more ships than anyone cared to count. Merchant vessels, tankers, even warships were sent to the bottom in those years. A missing submarine might easily have been written off as another casualty of war. Yet something about this case unsettled Daniel. He studied the faded photographs of the crew, rows of young men in pressed uniforms, their smiles hiding the uncertainty of wartime. He imagined them crowded into the steel belly of their vessel, fighting fatigue, salt air, and the gnawing fear of never returning. Why had their disappearance attracted so little follow-up? And why had the Navy seemed so eager to close the file? Commander Robert Miller joined Daniel in his study that evening, the older man carrying a folder of papers under his arm. His silver hair caught the lamplight, his face lined with the marks of a career at sea. "You've been digging," Miller said, settling into a chair. "I can tell by the mess on your desk." Daniel smiled faintly. "You know me, I can't let it go. I've read 3 different accounts of the submarine's final patrol, and they don't line up. One says they were chasing a U-boat, another says they were on a training mission, and then there's a third report that barely makes sense." Miller opened his folder and slid a few sheets toward him. "That's because history isn't always written for truth. Sometimes it's written for convenience. I served long enough to know how many mistakes were covered up because nobody wanted a scandal." The weight of those words pressed on Daniel. He knew Miller wasn't exaggerating. The commander had always been honest about the darker side of military bureaucracy. "I keep thinking about the crew," Daniel said quietly. "They didn't just vanish. Something happened, and if it was negligence or error, they deserve more than silence." Miller nodded slowly. "Then you need to follow the trail. But understand this. Once you go down that path, you won't like everything you find. Some doors were closed for a reason." The remark lingered in the air. Daniel studied the commander's face, searching for hesitation, but instead saw the steady gaze of someone who had lived through too many buried truths. Later, Daniel walked through the harbor alone. The Norfolk docks at night were a study in contrasts, the faint hum of modern warships preparing for duty, and the memory of vessels long gone. He pictured the submarine leaving port for its final patrol, its crew unaware of the fate awaiting them. The thought unsettled him deeply. He returned home with a resolve that burned sharper than before. If the official story faltered, then he would search elsewhere, letters, diaries, witness accounts. Somewhere someone had left a clue. And if he had to dig through every forgotten archive in Washington to find it, he would. The echoes of war were louder now, and they seemed to call directly to him. What Daniel did not yet realize was that the search would soon draw him closer to his own family's past, and to truths that had been carefully hidden for decades. The deeper Daniel searched, the more he sensed the story was shifting from professional curiosity to something far more intimate. One Saturday morning, as sunlight streamed across the wooden floor of his mother's old house in Virginia Beach, he climbed into the attic. Dust hung in the air like fine mist, and the creak of each step reminded him he hadn't been up there since before his grandfather passed away. In the corner, under a stack of weathered boxes, he found it, a small trunk with brass corners, its lock rusted but brittle with age. He knelt, heart racing, and pried it open. Inside lay carefully folded uniforms, photographs, and a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. The smell of old paper and sea salt seemed to escape at once, carrying him decades back. Daniel unfolded one letter, dated March 1945. The handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's, neat and deliberate. "We are escorting a submarine back from its patrol. The men seem tired but proud. I pray we all return safely." The words froze Daniel. His grandfather had mentioned a submarine, possibly the very one that vanished. He carried the trunk downstairs, his hands trembling. His mother, Claire, was in the kitchen, brewing tea. She looked up in surprise when he placed the box on the table. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice soft, wary. "In the attic." "Mum, why didn't you ever tell me Dad kept this?" Claire hesitated, her fingers resting on the rim of her cup. "Because he never wanted to talk about it. Those years haunted him, Daniel. He thought silence was a form of mercy." Daniel shook his head, staring at the letters. "But look at this. He mentions a submarine. Could it be the one they just found?" Her eyes clouded, torn between pride and fear. "I don't know, he never said. But if it was, maybe that explains his silence all these years." The weight of possibility pressed down on Daniel's chest. His grandfather hadn't been a distant observer of history. He had been tangled in the very mystery now resurfacing. Later that day, Daniel met with Emily Parker, a marine archaeologist he had crossed paths with at conferences before. She was younger than Miller, but carried herself with a calm authority born of countless dives. They sat at a quiet cafe overlooking the harbour, her dark hair pulled back, her expression sharp with curiosity as he laid out the letters. "Do you realize what this means?" Emily said after scanning the pages. "If your grandfather escorted that submarine, he might have been among the last people to see it alive. That's not just history, that's personal testimony, even if indirect." Daniel nodded, his fingers drumming on the table. "That's why I can't stop now. I need to understand what happened, for him and for me." Emily leaned back, arms crossed. "Then you'll need to do this the right way. Diving isn't a hobby out there. It's dangerous, unpredictable. If you're serious about exploring that wreck, you'll need proper preparation and a team who respects the science as much as the story." Her words carried both caution and challenge. Daniel knew his impulsive drive sometimes clashed with the measured approach of professional researchers. Yet he also recognized that Emily's perspective might keep him from losing control. "Will you help me?" he asked quietly. She studied him for a long moment before answering. "If we do this, we do it by the book. No shortcuts, no reckless dives." "If you can agree to that, then yes, I'll help." A strange relief washed over Daniel. He wasn't alone anymore. The weight of his grandfather's silence was heavy, but now it would be shared. As he walked home, clutching the letters, he realized the search was no longer just about uncovering history. It was about confronting the silence that had shaped his family for decades. The mystery of the submarine had become his own story, and it would demand everything from him. By the time Daniel stood at the dock preparing for the first expedition, the weight of his grandfather's letters had grown heavier. The faded ink seemed to whisper not only of history, but of unfinished business. Now, with Emily by his side, he was about to take the first tangible step toward answers. The morning air smelled of salt and diesel. Gulls cried overhead as the dive vessel rocked gently against its ropes. Crew members moved across the deck, checking lines, loading oxygen tanks, and securing gear. Daniel watched them with a mix of excitement and unease. He had done countless dives before, but never one shadowed by so much personal meaning. At the center of it all stood Captain Marcus Mac Donovan, a man in his 50s with a square jaw weathered by years at sea. His broad shoulders carried both confidence and caution. He greeted Daniel with a firm handshake that seemed to measure him as much as welcome him. "So," Mac said, his voice roughened by salt air and cigarettes, "you're the historian chasing ghosts. Emily tells me you've got the brains, but brains don't count for much if you panic at 60 meters down." Daniel forced a half smile. "I've held my own before. I'm not looking for glory, Captain, just the truth." Mac studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Good answer. Out here, the ocean doesn't care about your reasons. It'll test you all the same." Emily appeared at Daniel's side, clipboard in hand, her tone brisk. "We've charted the dive site coordinates. Currents are unpredictable in that area, so we'll have to time everything precisely. And Daniel," she added, glancing at him sharply, "no improvisation, stick to the plan." "I hear you," he replied, though a small flicker of resistance lingered inside. As the vessel left harbor, the coastline faded into a thin line, replaced by the endless stretch of Atlantic waters. The sea was calm, but beneath its surface lay wrecks, trenches, and history written in steel and silence. Daniel leaned against the railing, the spray cool against his face, and imagined his grandfather standing watch decades earlier on an escort ship, staring at the same horizon. Mac joined him, lighting a cigarette. "You know," he said, exhaling smoke that curled into the wind, "I've ferried treasure hunters, archaeologists, even thrill-seekers out here. Most of them are looking for riches or fame. You look like a man trying to settle something deeper." Daniel met his eyes. "My grandfather might have known something about that submarine. He never spoke of it. If I can find out what really happened, maybe I'll finally understand him." Mac flicked ash into the sea. "The dead have a way of dragging the living with them. Just don't let the weight pull you under." Hours later, the crew gathered around a map spread across the galley table. Emily traced their route with a pencil, explaining how sonar scans from a previous expedition had indicated the presence of a large vessel resting upright on the seafloor. The location lay near the infamous stretch known as Torpedo Alley. "Visibility may be poor," Emily said, "and we'll be dealing with strong currents. Safety comes first. We'll document everything methodically." Daniel nodded, absorbing her words. He admired her clarity, even if her disciplined tone sometimes felt like a leash on his restless urgency. Mac ended the briefing with a clap of his hands. "All right, folks. We're not here to play heroes. We're here to work. Tomorrow morning we drop anchor at the site. Get some rest while you can." That night Daniel lay awake in his bunk, the ship's gentle sway mirroring the churn of his thoughts. The sound of the waves against the hull reminded him of the submarine's crew, their last nights alive, spent in similar confinement. He whispered into the dark, almost as if his grandfather could hear, "I'm coming. They'll find out what you couldn't say." The ocean waited, vast and indifferent. The real test would begin at dawn. The morning broke grey and heavy. Clouds stretched low across the Atlantic horizon. The dive vessel bobbed gently as the crew prepared, their movements efficient but tinged with the quiet intensity that always came before a dive into unknown waters. Daniel suited up slowly, his hands tightening the straps of his gear with a precision born not only of habit, but of nerves. The hiss of compressed air filled his ears as Emily checked his tank. "You ready?" she asked, her tone clipped but not unkind. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, trying to hide the tremor of anticipation in his voice. Captain Mac watched from the deck, arms crossed. "Remember what I told you," he barked. "The ocean doesn't care who you are. Respect her or she'll take you." Daniel gave a short nod. "I won't forget." The divers slipped into the water one by one. Cold Atlantic currents surged around Daniel as he descended, bubbles streaming upward into the dim light above. The deeper he went, the more the surface world faded until only the hiss of his regulator and the steady beat of his heart remained. The water pressed against him, thick and unyielding, as shadows stretched across the seafloor. Emily swam just ahead, her flashlight cutting through the murk. Visibility was poor. Clouds of sediment swirled with each current, reducing the world to a tunnel of greenish haze. Daniel fought the urge to glance constantly over his shoulder, the sense of being watched gnawing at the edges of his mind. Then, through the shifting gloom, a shape emerged, massive, silent. The bow of a submarine rose from the darkness like some long-slumbering giant. Its steel hull was draped in coral and rust, but the structure was unmistakably intact. Daniel's pulse quickened. Here it was, the very submarine lost for 70 years. He hovered in front of the vessel, awe mingling with sorrow. The identification numbers etched faintly on the side confirmed what the headlines had only suggested. This wasn't just another wreck. It was the submarine that had haunted both history and his family's silence. Emily's voice crackled through the comms. "Hull's intact, no sign of external detonation. Interesting." Daniel forced words past the lump in his throat. "It's like time just stopped down here." They swam along the length of the submarine, their lights catching fragments of history frozen in place. A shattered periscope, a hatch sealed tight, an anchor resting motionless in sand. The silence was oppressive, as if the ocean itself guarded the story within. Suddenly Daniel's fin brushed against something sharp. He turned his light and saw a tangle of fishing net wrapped around part of the hull. Panic flared as the net caught his gear. He kicked hard, but the fibers only tightened. His chest tightened with each second, the hiss of his regulator now thunder in his ears. "Daniel, stop moving." Emily's voice cut through, calm and steady. She swam toward him, her knife flashing as she carefully sliced through the strands. "Breathe slow, stay still." He obeyed, though adrenaline surged in his veins. At last, the final strand gave way, and he floated free. Relief washed over him, mixed with humiliation. "First lesson," Emily said firmly, her eyes locking with his through her mask. "The ocean punishes panic." "You'll remember that," Daniel nodded, chastened. "I owe you." They continued their survey, recording details, marking the hull number for verification. Each glance at the submarine stirred something inside him, a blend of pride, grief, and the gnawing need to know what had happened here. As they began their slow ascent back to the surface, Daniel looked down one last time at the silent vessel. The submarine rested peacefully, but its silence was heavy with unanswered questions. He broke the surface, lungs heaving, the grey sky above seeming brighter than before. Emily pulled off her mask, her face flushed with effort. "You saw it," she said quietly. "It's real, and it's only the beginning." Daniel stared out at the horizon, heart still pounding. He knew she was right. The descent had given him proof, but proof was only the first step toward truth. The following day, Daniel felt the weight of anticipation pressing on him more than the gear strapped across his back. The first descent had revealed the submarine's presence, but now they were going inside. He tried to steady his breathing as the crew checked equipment on deck, the tang of salt and diesel thick in the air. Emily approached, pulling her hood over her hair, her expression steady. "You'll need to keep your focus sharper than yesterday," she said. "Inside a wreck, space is tighter, visibility worse. Panic isn't an option." Daniel nodded. "I won't forget." Mac, standing nearby, gave a low grunt. "Remember, respect the dead. You're stepping into their tomb." The words struck Daniel harder than he expected. Tomb. He hadn't allowed himself to think of it that way, but that's exactly what it was. The cold embrace of the Atlantic swallowed them once again. As the submarine's shadow emerged from the gloom, Daniel's heart pounded. They moved toward a hatch, its edges crusted with barnacles, and Emily carefully guided them inside. The beam of their flashlights sliced through the darkness. The airless silence seemed almost alive, pressing against them as they floated through narrow passages. Every surface was coated in rust and silt, every corner holding the weight of time. Daniel's eyes caught on a faded photograph pinned near a bunk. Two young men smiling in uniform. The sight hit him with unexpected force. These weren't nameless sailors. They were sons, brothers, husbands. Their lives had ended here, sealed within these steel walls. He steadied his hand as he brushed silt off a locker. Inside lay a set of boots neatly placed, as though waiting for a man who never returned. Emily's voice came through the comms, hushed despite the impossibility of sound carrying. "It's incredibly preserved. Personal effects, equipment. It's like stepping into 1945. Daniel swallowed hard. "It feels wrong to touch anything. Like we're intruding." "Documentation isn't intrusion," she countered gently. "It's remembrance. These details matter." They pressed deeper into the vessel. The control room was still intact, gauges frozen, levers unmoved since the final day. Daniel ran his light across the walls, imagining the chaos of the last moments. The crew fighting to understand what was happening, or perhaps realizing too late that no escape remained. The silence was suffocating. He felt the echo of lives cut short, a haunting weight pressing against his chest. His grandfather's silence seemed clearer now, not cowardice but reverence. Maybe he couldn't bear to speak because the memory was too sacred, too unbearable. Daniel paused before a row of bunks, the small space littered with personal traces. A journal floated where it had been wedged, its pages stiffened with seawater. His gloved hands trembled as he picked it up carefully, securing it in a bag Emily carried for artifacts. Emily's eyes met his. This could be a breakthrough, a first-hand account from the crew. Daniel nodded, though his throat tightened. Each discovery felt like a violation and a gift at the same time. They made their way back toward the exit, the pressure of the ocean above them suddenly heavier, as though reluctant to let them leave. Before exiting, Daniel turned one last time to the silent control room. He whispered under his breath, knowing no one could hear but himself, "I'll tell your story, I promise." Breaking the surface was like waking from a dream. He ripped off his mask, drawing in the sharp sea air. Emily climbed aboard beside him, her face unreadable, though her eyes carried the same heaviness. On deck, Mac studied their expressions. "Well?" Daniel sat heavily, still catching his breath. "It's not just a wreck," he said quietly. "It's a grave, and it feels like they've been waiting for someone to listen." The others exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The silence of the submarine had followed them back, heavy and unbroken. The galley table on the vessel was littered with notes, sketches, and damp artifacts drying in trays. The air smelled of salt and strong coffee as the team gathered, their faces drawn with fatigue but sharpened by adrenaline. The discovery of the journal and other personal belongings had given them a glimpse into the lives of the lost crew, but what had caused the submarine to vanish remained maddeningly unclear. Emily tapped her pen against the table, her tone firm. "The hull shows no evidence of torpedo impact. No gashes, no ruptures consistent with an external explosion. That suggests a technical malfunction, a flooding issue, engine failure, maybe even a fire." Daniel leaned forward, eyes burning with frustration. "You saw the state of that vessel. It didn't look like a submarine that just broke down. Everything was intact, almost too intact. If it wasn't an enemy strike, then maybe it was something worse, a mistake, a cover-up." Captain Mac crossed his arms, watching the two like a referee. "Cover-up's a heavy word to throw around. Sometimes a wreck is just a wreck." Daniel slammed a hand against the table, the sound echoing through the galley. "No, my grandfather mentioned escorting a submarine. If it was this one, and if something happened, then maybe he carried that guilt for the rest of his life. You think that silence was for nothing?" The outburst silenced the room. Emily's eyes softened, though her tone stayed measured. "Daniel, I'm not dismissing your grandfather's pain, but science needs evidence, not speculation. Right now, the most plausible explanation is mechanical failure. Submarines in that era were notoriously fragile. One wrong valve, one unnoticed leak, and it's over." Daniel's fists clenched. "Convenient. That way, no one has to admit responsibility. It's just a machine breaking down. But what if it wasn't? What if someone ordered something they shouldn't have?" Mac exhaled heavily, pulling a cigarette from his shirt pocket, though he didn't light it. "You're both too deep in your own trenches. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between. Submarines went missing for all kinds of reasons back then. Enemy fire, equipment failure, friendly fire, you name it. The ocean doesn't give explanations, and the Navy sure as hell didn't like admitting mistakes." The tension around the table thickened. Daniel stared at the photographs spread before him, the young faces of the crew, smiling with a confidence they couldn't have known was misplaced. Each smile looked like a demand for answers. Emily broke the silence first. "We'll need to cross-reference the artifacts with naval logs from 1945. If this was a mechanical failure, the maintenance records might point to it. If there's something more, maybe the logs will show irregularities." Mac raised an eyebrow. "And if the logs are missing? Then we'll know we've hit a nerve," Daniel muttered. Emily shot him a sharp look. "Careful. You can't force the past into the shape you want. Sometimes the truth is simpler than the story we imagine." Daniel met her gaze, his voice low. "And sometimes the truth is buried because no one wanted it found." The ship groaned as it rocked against the swells, the sound like a reminder of the ocean's presence around them. Each of them fell silent, lost in thought. Theories clashed, but none of them yet held the weight of certainty. At last, Mac pushed back from the table. "Argue all you want, but remember, you're dealing with men's graves down there. Don't let your theories blind you to that." His words cut through the air, sobering them. Daniel sat back, his anger still simmering but tempered by the reminder. He looked again at the journal they had recovered, its swollen pages fragile with age. Somewhere inside its faded words might be the first real clue, the voice of a sailor who had lived those final days. And Daniel knew he would follow that voice, wherever it led, even if it pulled him into truths more dangerous than he was ready to face. The long drive to Washington, D.C. was silent for most of the way. Daniel stared out the passenger window, watching the Virginia countryside give way to concrete sprawl and government buildings. Beside him, Commander Miller gripped the steering wheel with the calm of a man who'd walked these halls before. "Don't expect miracles," Miller said, breaking the silence. "Even retired, I can only get us so far. And the Navy doesn't exactly leave its skeletons out in the open." "I'm not looking for miracles," Daniel muttered, "just answers." The National Archives sprawled like a fortress of forgotten truth, its beige stone walls hiding decades of secrets. Inside, they passed through layers of security, their credentials examined with perfunctory nods. Miller led them through long corridors until they reached the restricted research wing. A clerk in a pressed shirt glanced at their request and raised an eyebrow. "You're looking into the USS Aeneas?" he asked, his tone too casual for Daniel's liking. "That's correct," Miller replied. "Operational records, communications logs, maintenance reports, 1945. The clerk disappeared into the back. Minutes passed. When he returned, he was no longer casual. "Most of the records you requested are either classified or redacted. A few were transferred to microfilm. You can view those under supervision." Daniel felt his frustration rise. Why would records from 1945 still be classified? The clerk shrugged. "That's above my pay grade." They were led to a sterile viewing room. Daniel sat at the machine while Miller hovered nearby. He loaded the first reel, watching faded text scroll across the screen. Movement orders, personnel rosters, encrypted transmissions. Then came the file that stopped him cold. An internal memo dated April 12, 1945, just 2 days after the Aeneas's final transmission. The heading read, "Incident, Exercise Redacted. Unidentified contact. No visual confirmation." Daniel leaned closer. "This isn't a combat report, it's a training summary." Miller frowned. "Wait, scroll down." The next line was mostly blacked out, but 2 phrases stood out. "Live fire protocol breach" and "friendly vessel status unknown." Daniel's voice trembled. They hit something during a training exercise. "And they weren't sure what it was." Miller crossed his arms. "And didn't report it properly or buried it. That fits the Navy of the time. Too many moving parts, too much chaos in the final months of the war." Daniel couldn't tear his eyes from the screen. If the Aeneas was mistaken for an enemy sub during a live fire drill, they'd have every reason to erase it, Miller finished. Especially with the war winding down, no one wanted scandal. They wanted medals and closure. Daniel sat back, reeling. The weight of it settled in his chest. This wasn't a clean story. It was tangled in bureaucracy, human error, and silence. They printed what they could. Half-redacted reports, vague memos, cryptic orders. Outside, under the weak autumn sun, Daniel stared at the documents in his hands, his heart pounding with both vindication and dread. "So that's it," he said. "They didn't just vanish. They were killed in a mistake, and the Navy hid it." "Looks that way," Miller replied. "But you'll need more than this to prove it outright. This is smoke, not fire." Back in the car, Daniel felt hollow. He had come for clarity, but all he'd found was a deeper maze. And yet something in him shifted. "They died not knowing why," he said. "Their families were never told the truth. My grandfather lived with that silence every day." Miller nodded slowly. "The truth was too heavy for a lot of men, but now it's yours to carry. Just make sure you're ready for that weight." Daniel stared out the window as the city faded behind them. The puzzle was far from solved, but one thing was clear. The past wasn't buried. It had just been hidden, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig it back up. The old house felt quieter than usual, the way homes do when memories rise to the surface. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the files from Washington spread before him. The light through the window cast soft gold across the floor, but it couldn't warm the chill settling in his chest. Across from him, his mother read the printed memo with trembling hands, her brow furrowed as she moved her lips silently over the words. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "I knew there were things your grandfather never talked about," Claire said, voice breaking, "but I thought it was the war in general. I never imagined it was something like this." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "I don't think he could talk about it. And after everything I've found, I think he felt responsible. Even if he wasn't the one who gave the order." Claire set the paper down carefully, like it might tear from the weight of what it said. "He always sat outside at sunset, said the sea gave him peace, but sometimes I'd catch him crying, quietly, and I never knew why." Daniel nodded slowly. "Because he saw it happen. Or maybe he didn't see it, but he knew. He was part of the escort." They mistook the Aeneas for something else. Fired. And then it vanished. His mother's shoulders dropped. He never forgave himself. There was a long silence, filled only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. Finally, Daniel reached into the trunk he had brought from the attic and pulled out one more envelope. It was addressed to his grandfather, but unopened. Postmarked weeks after the Aeneas disappeared. The return address bore the name Thomas R. Vale, one of the crew members Daniel had seen listed in the sub's final roster. He opened it carefully. The letter inside was brief but heartfelt. "Tommy, I'm back in Norfolk next week. Can't wait to swap stories. I owe you one for watching my back during that last patrol. You're a good man. Jack." Claire read it with a shaking hand. "So, not all of them went down with the sub?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I think Jack sent this before he knew what happened. Before the Aeneas vanished. There were no survivors, not officially." His mother folded the letter and held it tightly. "He kept this. All these years. Maybe as a reminder of what he couldn't undo." Daniel's thoughts churned. The emotional puzzle was taking clearer shape. His grandfather wasn't a villain. He wasn't even negligent. He had simply been caught in a moment that spiraled out of control and had lived with the silence ever since. "I don't know what I expected to find when I started," Daniel admitted. "Part of me wanted a clean explanation, a technical error, something no one could have prevented. But this is human, tragic and messy." Claire looked at him, her eyes steady now. "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet, but I can't bury it again. If the Navy won't acknowledge what happened, maybe it's time someone else did. Maybe it's time those men got more than a footnote in a forgotten archive." She nodded slowly, then placed her hand over his. "Whatever you choose, do it with the same integrity he lived by. He wouldn't want revenge, he'd want truth and peace." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, less anger, more purpose. The wreck wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a legacy. A silent weight passed down through generations, finally brought into the light. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying the scent of the nearby bay. Daniel stood and looked toward the horizon. The sea hadn't taken his grandfather's story, it had only delayed its telling. The storm rolled in without warning, the sky darkening by the hour as the vessel pitched against mounting waves. The second expedition had been scheduled with precision, but the Atlantic didn't care about plans. Emily stood at the helm of the cabin, scanning weather data, while Mac barked orders to the crew, securing loose equipment and adjusting course. "We've got a window," Mac growled. "It's narrow and it's ugly, but if we go now we can get the dive in and surface before the worst hits." "You sure about this?" Daniel tightened the straps of his gear, already feeling the pressure in his chest, not from the storm, but from the need to go back. The journal had hinted at a final entry, pages stuck together from decades underwater. Emily had carefully separated them, revealing a name. "Vale," Daniel said. "Thomas R. Vale. My grandfather mentioned him once. Said he was like a brother." Emily zipped her dry suit, her jaw tight. "Then we find him. The dive was brutal. The sea heaved above them, and even beneath the surface, the surge pushed hard. Visibility was worse than before. Particles clouded the water like ash, turning their lights into dim halos." They reached the submarine, now a familiar silhouette in the gloom, but this time they aimed for the crew quarters. The corridor felt narrower, the silence heavier. Emily led them to the far end of the vessel, past bunks and lockers, until they reached a sealed compartment. Inside, Daniel's light landed on a brass plaque. It read, T.R. Vale. His breath caught. This was his bunk. He floated closer, sweeping his light across the small space. A metal box sat wedged beneath the frame. He reached out slowly, carefully dislodging it. The lid creaked open, revealing a bundle of items wrapped in oilskin. Photographs, a cigarette case, a folded handkerchief, and at the bottom a set of dog tags. Daniel stared. They're his. Emily hovered beside him. Anything else? He pulled out one final item, a letter barely legible but still intact enough to read later. His heart pounded as he secured the contents in a waterproof pouch. Just as they turned to leave, a violent surge slammed Daniel sideways. His tank struck the wall and pain shot up his ribs. The silt exploded into a dense fog. He lost sight of Emily in seconds. Emily? Emily? His voice echoed through the comms, panicked. I'm here, she replied, strained. Stay calm, stay where you are. He tried to breathe slowly, but pain throbbed with each inhale. The lights flickered. The confined space pressed in tighter than ever. He drifted slowly, gripping the wall, trying not to let fear overtake reason. Seconds stretched. Then her light cut through the murk. She grabbed his harness and steadied him. You're okay, we're going up, now. They exited the wreck and began their ascent, the storm above churning the water violently. Daniel's head spun as they broke the surface. The dive crew hauled them aboard, voices rising against the wind. Mac pulled off his gloves, eyes narrowing. You both all right? I hit the wall, Daniel said through clenched teeth. But I've got something. Vale's tags. And a letter. Emily sat beside him, her arms folded tightly across her chest. That was too close. Daniel nodded. But worth it. She didn't argue. Later, in the shelter of the cabin, Daniel held the tags in his hand. They were heavier than he expected, slick with salt but unmistakably real. The letter, too fragile to open immediately, lay sealed in a protective case. What do you think it says? Emily asked. Daniel looked at the waves outside, then back at the worn metal in his palm. Maybe the truth, or maybe just a goodbye. Either way, we owe it to him to find out. The storm lashed the windows, but inside, the silence was purposeful. The wreck had given up more of its story, but not all of it. The storm passed by morning, leaving the sea eerily calm, as if the chaos of the night had never happened. On the deck, Daniel sat with the letter from Vale laid out before him, its edges still damp but legible. The ink had faded in places, but the words remained. To whoever finds this, if this boat is ever found, tell our families we fought to the end, we weren't attacked. Something went wrong above us. We don't know what. 1 second it was quiet. The next, there was shaking. Lights gone. We dove too deep to surface. Air's getting thin. We kept hoping someone would realize that they'd come back. They didn't. Daniel's throat closed as he read aloud, the words catching like gravel. Emily listened silently, sitting across from him, the salt wind brushing strands of hair across her face. We weren't ready to die, but we accepted it. Tell Tommy's wife he never stopped talking about her. Tell Sullivan's mother he was brave. Tell anyone who'll listen that we mattered. We were here. Daniel folded the letter carefully and stared out over the water. They knew, he said. They knew something hit them. They knew no one was coming. Emily spoke softly. They faced the end with more grace than most would. Silence lingered. Back inside the cabin, the table was covered with personal items recovered from the wreck. Photos, letters, engraved lighters, small tokens of lives left unfinished. Daniel picked up a dog-eared photograph of 3 young men in uniform, grinning under a summer sun. Every one of them had a story, he said. People waiting back home, people who never got the truth. Emily nodded. That's the part history always forgets. We get caught up in theories and causes, but the real cost is here. In these objects, these words, these faces. Daniel looked at the box holding Vale's tags. Do we publish this? Make it all public? She hesitated. That's not a simple question. Why not? He pressed. They deserve to be remembered. The truth deserves to be told. I agree. But not all families want that kind of closure. Some may have found their peace in not knowing. Others may be angry that we disturbed what was left. We can't assume what's right for everyone." He frowned, then leaned forward. But silence didn't help them either. "My grandfather carried guilt for decades because no one ever told the truth." Emily met his gaze. "Then maybe the way forward isn't just about truth. Maybe it's about how we tell it, respectfully, carefully, with permission where we can get it." Daniel sat back, exhaling. "So we contact the families." She nodded. "We try. We gather what we can. And we share the story with dignity, not as a scandal but as a memorial." Later that day, Daniel reached out to a contact in Veterans Affairs. "A list of names, next of kin. It would be a slow process, each call requiring care, empathy, and the readiness to be met with grief or silence or gratitude." One by one, they started making those calls. Some families wept. Others asked for copies of the letters, the photographs. Some had lived for decades believing the submarine had simply malfunctioned. One woman said, "He was 19. They said it was quick. You're telling me it wasn't." Daniel didn't have answers that would ease every wound, but he gave them honesty, and in return, something shifted. The weight of secrecy began to lift, not entirely, but enough to breathe. That night, alone on the deck, Daniel looked at the stars reflecting over the waves. He whispered to the dark, "You weren't forgotten." Not anymore. The sea, as always, said nothing. But this time it didn't need to. The hearing room at the Naval Historical Center in Washington was cold, its fluorescent lights too bright, its walls too bare. Daniel stood at the podium, palms sweating as he placed the binder of evidence in front of him. He looked out at the panel, 4 senior officers, 1 civilian historian, and a Navy legal representative whose face had not changed expression since they entered. Beside Daniel sat Emily, her expression unreadable, but her presence grounding. She'd organized the documentation meticulously, photographs, sonar maps, transcripts from the recovered journal, the declassified memos. It was all there. The weight of 70 years of silence pressed on every page. Daniel cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're not here today to accuse, but to acknowledge. The men of the USS Aeneas disappeared in 1945. Their families were given vague reports. Technical failure, presumed lost, no further details. But the evidence we've gathered tells a different story." He opened the binder. A training exercise, a misidentified contact, a possible friendly fire incident, a series of decisions that led to silence instead of accountability. A vice admiral on the panel frowned. "Mr. Harris, those are serious implications. Are you prepared to stand by them publicly?" Daniel looked him squarely in the eye. "Yes, sir. With respect, the implications are already buried with those men. What we're asking for is recognition, a correction to the record, closure for their families." The Navy legal advisor leaned forward. "Even if what you say is true, the policy at the time may have been to prevent panic, preserve morale, maintain focus on the war effort. Context matters." Emily spoke before Daniel could. "And so does conscience." The room went still. She stood. These were not just sailors. They were human beings with families who deserved honesty. "We are not here to disrupt policy. We are here to give voice to those who never had the chance to speak." The civilian historian on the panel adjusted his glasses. "You've presented strong circumstantial evidence, but without direct orders or surviving communications explicitly admitting the mistake, this will remain a theory, plausible, persuasive, but unofficial." Daniel opened the letter from Thomas R. Vail and read the final lines aloud. "We weren't attacked. Something went wrong above us. We don't know what." He closed it gently. "How much more direct do they need to be?" They knew. They died knowing. One of the officers flipped through the binder, stopping on the sonar scan of the intact hull. "If we acknowledged this formally, it would be the first time in decades the Navy admitted to a wartime friendly fire incident on record." Daniel didn't flinch. "Then it's long overdue." The panel recessed for deliberation. Outside in the hallway, Daniel leaned against the cool marble wall, staring at nothing. Emily joined him, arms folded. "You did everything you could," she said quietly. "I don't want a plaque," he replied. "I want the truth to matter. I want my grandfather's silence to mean something more than regret." She nodded. "Even if they don't acknowledge it now, others will. You've documented everything. You've given the families something they never had, a story that feels real." The panel returned an hour later with their response. Official recognition would not be issued. The evidence, though compelling, was deemed insufficient to overturn the historical record. However, the Navy agreed to add a footnote in their archives, acknowledging the possibility of misidentification and promising to make all non-classified materials from the Aeneas incident publicly accessible. It wasn't the full truth, but it was no longer a total silence. Daniel shook each panel member's hand, thanked them, and left with Emily into the late afternoon light. He felt disappointment, yes, but also a strange calm. Something had shifted. The past had spoken, even if the present still hesitated to listen fully. And the consequences of truth, once spoken aloud, could not be buried again. The autumn air in Norfolk carried a quiet chill, not yet winter, but sharp enough to make Daniel pull his jacket tighter as he stepped onto the porch of his family's old home. The same porch where his grandfather had sat for years, watching the tide come and go without a word about the war that shaped his life. Daniel held a copy of the Navy's updated public archive summary in his hand. It was brief, almost too brief, but it was there. A footnote, acknowledgement that the USS Aeneas may have been lost during a friendly fire incident. No names, no blame, just a line. But that line broke 70 years of silence. Claire opened the door, her smile tight with emotion. "You're early." "I needed to be here," Daniel said, stepping inside. They sat at the kitchen table, a pot of coffee between them, the light soft and golden from the window. Daniel placed the document in front of her. "They didn't admit everything," he said. "But they didn't deny it either. It's a start." Claire traced the line with her fingers. "He would have never asked for this, but I think he would have felt less alone." Daniel nodded, staring into his cup. "He carried it all by himself. I used to think he was just distant, but now I understand he wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting everyone else." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Later that day, Daniel drove to the cemetery. The leaves rustled in the wind, and the scent of pine hung in the cool air. He knelt by his grandfather's grave, the stone simple, William Harris, U.S. Navy, 1921-1998. He placed a folded letter at the base, Vale's letter. A copy, not the original. "I found them," Daniel said softly. "I found the truth. You weren't the reason they died. But you remembered them." Every day, the wind carried his words, and he imagined, no, he believed, that some part of his grandfather heard them. Back at the harbor, Emily was waiting by the dive vessel, clipboard in hand, going over final documentation before submitting their report to the Maritime Historical Society. She looked up as Daniel approached. "I went to the cemetery," he said. She nodded, understanding. "Closure?" "Not exactly, but maybe clarity." Emily tucked the clipboard under her arm. "You did something important, Daniel. Most people never get this far. They walk away from history. You walked into it." He gave a tired smile. "Because I had to. It wasn't just about the submarine. It was about what silence does, what it costs. And what truth can restore," she added. They stood together, watching the water lap against the dock. Daniel felt a strange sense of weightlessness, like something heavy had finally been set down. "You know," he said, "he never told me a single story about the war, not one. And now I know why. It wasn't fear. It was honor. He thought if he stayed quiet, the memory would be preserved." Emily looked at him, her expression soft. "Maybe now the memory is stronger because you gave it voice." Daniel turned toward the sea, where the horizon cut a clean line between water and sky. "I used to think silence was the end of the story. Now I know. It's just the space waiting to be filled." She smiled. "And you filled it." The harbor was calm, but Daniel felt something alive beneath the stillness. Not ghosts, not echoes, just the truth finally awake. The USS Aeneas was no longer just a wreck resting in the dark. It was a vessel of memory, and its story had returned to the surface. The boat cut gently across the morning tide, its wake curling through calm waters as the coastline disappeared behind them. Daniel stood at the stern, the box in his hands resting heavily against his chest. Inside it were the personal belongings of the crew: dog tags, the journal, faded photographs, and the recovered letter from Thomas Vale. Each item had been carefully preserved, each chosen for a single purpose: remembrance. The families had responded. Not all, but enough. Some sent letters, some called. A few made the journey to Norfolk to meet him in person. One woman, the daughter of a young radio operator lost on the Aeneas, had taken his hand and said, "He died scared, but now I can stop imagining he was forgotten." That was the moment Daniel knew what had to come next. Emily stood beside him now, silent, watching the horizon. Captain Mack stood at the helm. Even he had forgone his usual sarcasm, guiding the vessel with a quiet reverence. When they reached the coordinates, the engine died. Silence settled over the deck. The water below was still and dark, as though holding its breath. Daniel stepped forward and placed the box on the railing. "We're here today," he began, voice steady. "Not to reopen wounds, but to close them the right way. For 70 years, the men aboard the USS Aeneas were listed as missing, presumed dead. No explanations, no answers, just absence." He paused, the wind brushing against his face. "They served with honor. They died in confusion. But now, they are no longer nameless. They are no longer forgotten." He opened the box and began placing items one by one into the sea. The tags fell with a soft splash. The photograph of 3 sailors in uniform fluttered once before sinking. The journal, sealed in a waterproof case, followed. When he reached the letter, he hesitated. He read it one last time, then looked out across the vast ocean. "Your words found their way," he whispered. "We heard you." He let go. The letter drifted down, slow and solemn. Emily stepped forward next. She unfolded a paper of her own, names of the crew carefully typed, one line after another. She began to read them aloud. Each name was followed by silence, and in that silence Daniel felt something shift in the air, as if the sea, at last, acknowledged them too. Mac lowered the flag to half-mast. No one spoke, no one moved. Minutes passed. Daniel finally exhaled. "That's it," he said. "They're home now." The return journey was quiet. No one needed to speak. The gesture had been simple, but its meaning was etched into every soul on board. Back on shore, Daniel walked the pier slowly. Emily caught up to him. "You did it," she said softly. "You gave them peace." He looked toward the water. "Not just them. I think I gave it to him too, my grandfather. All these years he held on to something he thought he wasn't allowed to release. Now it's not just his burden anymore." They stood side by side, the salt air wrapping around them. "Will you keep going?" she asked. "Find other stories like this?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Then, "I think I have to. There are too many silences out there, too many voices still waiting to be heard." Emily smiled. "Then I'll be there when you do." Daniel nodded, feeling the quiet settle into something deeper, something whole. The wreck would remain beneath the waves, untouched and preserved, but now it had a name, a history, a legacy. It no longer rested in darkness. The museum was quiet just before opening. Daniel walked slowly through the exhibit hall, past glass cases filled with naval artifacts, each item carefully preserved, each label telling a piece of a larger story. At the end of the corridor stood a new addition, a modest display dedicated to the USS Aeneas. Inside the case, resting on a dark velvet backing, were copies of the recovered dog tags, the sealed journal, and a black-and-white photograph of the crew. Beneath them, a brass plaque read, "In honor of the 73 men who served aboard the USS Aeneas, lost April 10th, 1945, found, remembered." Daniel stood silently, hands in his pockets, heart steady. He hadn't come to relive the pain. He came to witness the healing. The truth hadn't come all at once. It had arrived piece by piece, revealed through wreckage, words, and long-hidden memories. But now, it lived here, in the open, for all to see. Emily approached quietly, holding 2 coffees. She handed one to him and stood beside him, both watching the case. "It's not a monument," she said, "but it feels like one." Daniel nodded. "It doesn't need to be massive. It just needs to be true." A group of schoolchildren entered the hall behind them, led by a tour guide. They passed through the exhibit, pausing at each stop. When they reached the Aeneas display, one boy leaned in close to read the plaque. "Did they ever find out what happened to them?" he asked. The guide hesitated. "Yes, eventually. It took a long time, but the truth came out, thanks to people who didn't give up." Daniel and Emily exchanged a glance. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Outside, the sky was a brilliant blue, and the harbor shimmered beneath it. Daniel walked to the edge of the pier and looked out at the horizon, the same view his grandfather had watched for so many years. The sea was calm now, and Daniel no longer felt haunted by it. In his jacket pocket, he carried a small envelope. Inside was the last photo he'd found in the box, a picture of his grandfather, arm around Thomas Vale, both grinning in their uniforms. On the back, in his grandfather's handwriting, "Some bonds outlive war." He placed the envelope on a bench near the water and walked away without looking back. As he and Emily reached the end of the pier, she asked, "So what comes next?" Daniel smiled. "Another wreck, another story. Maybe not as personal, but just as important." "You ever get tired of chasing ghosts?" He looked at her. "I'm not chasing them. I'm listening to them." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of salt and memory. The sea would always hold secrets, but some at least had been brought to light. Daniel felt no more need to prove anything. The silence was gone. The legacy had shifted. He had begun this journey looking for answers about a submarine. What he found was far more connection, truth, and the realization that remembering is a kind of justice. As they turned the corner, he paused one last time and looked over his shoulder at the water. "Rest well," he murmured. Then he walked on. Before we close this journey, if this story moved you, we invite you to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true stories that honor the past and speak to the present. And if you're ready for the next story, click on the video suggested on your screen right now. The sea still holds many secrets. Let's uncover them together.